I'm Fran. I'm going to skip the part where I talk about myself because I'll be doing that later in the talk. But yeah, this is my talk about PICO-8. If you're in the wrong room and you don't want to know about this, then feel free to leave now. But yeah, this talk is basically about PICO-8 and why I like PICO-8. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just introduce you all to the tool. I'll try to give you a sense of what this thing is, because it's kind of a weird piece of software. And then I'll tell you basically why I like it, and from that maybe we can learn a little bit about tools in general. So PICO-8 is a fantasy console. So if you think of a console in the sense of like video game consoles like PlayStations and Xboxes, PICO-8 is sort of like that, except that PICO-8, there's no actual hardware for it, right? It's all imaginary. So when you're running a game on PICO-8, it's all in software. So PICO-8 is a platform that you run games on, but it is also the tool that you use to make those games and edit those games. So it's this weird thing where it is both it's like a code editor, game engine, but at the same time it is the software that you run games on. So maybe to get you a better sense of like what this thing is, we'll just like open it up and I'll show you a little bit. So PICO-8 is right here. It's an app that you can just download from each internet. Sorry. So this is it. So you can just go, if you want to download it yourself, you can go just Google PICO-8, I forget the exact website, but it's $15. It's closed source. So you do have to buy it if you want to use it, unless you want to be naughty and torrent it from somewhere. Yeah, this is it. The first thing it does is it drops you into this like command line emulator, right? So it's not like a bash shell or anything, but it's like sort of similar, right? So you have this idea of like we're in this directory right now, we can see like all the different like games we have. So all these files, these .p8 files, are PICO-8 files, and these are all things that you can run on the PICO-8. And so if we want to actually run one of these, let's just load this Celeste one. We load it. Don't worry about the PNG thing right now. So we load it, and then we want to actually play it. Doesn't matter. So now we're actually playing a game. At any point while you're playing a game, maybe you can hear me in a second. Cool. Okay. So at any point while you're playing the game, you can press escape, and you'll back out to this command line. And now, since we've loaded the game, you can press escape again, and now you can see the source code for that game, right? And so any game that you play on PICO-8, you can immediately see the source code in like a couple of button presses, which is pretty cool. So, and you can edit this source code and like actually change the game in real time, right? So like, I thought the game was a little bit too hard, so let's change the jump. Here it sets the character's speed to -2 in the y-axis, right? So it's like it's making it go up by 2 units. If we set it to 10 and we like quintuple the speed, we can go back into the game. And now we jump super fast. Now the game is a lot easier, but I still can't win. And so some other things that you can do is we can back out again and go into the code, and we can go and see that there's these other like tabs, right? So this is the code tab. There's also the sprite tab, and so this is all the sprites that are in the game. And so like there's keys, there's little strawberries you collect. These are like the sprites for the bound, like the walls and the floors of the game. We can like go in and actually change these. So like I like yellow in general, and this red affects me, and so I'm going to change it to yellow. I go ahead and run the game. Her hair is yellow, right? So that's pretty cool. Some other things that you can do is this is the map tab, and so you can see that this is like the level editor. And so like these sprites that you make in the sprite tab, now they become stamps that you can sort of draw with in this map editor. So if we wanted like more balloons in the level, we just kind of place them everywhere. And so if we back out and run that, like they would be in the level. Let's just do that real quick. Right. So now that we got balloons. A couple of other cool things you can do is, I'll turn the sound back on for this. They has also an in-app sound effect editor and music sequencer. So you can just edit the actual sound effects in here. So this is like the jump sound effect that they use, but we can make it a little more interesting. Cool. And so we'll probably do that. And then you can also edit the music, right? So this is the background is and we can go in and just, get a little creative. Now we run it. So that's pretty cool. And then another thing we can do is, instead of starting from a game that we find online, we can start from scratch and make our own game. So we want to save changes. No, we don't. And so we can, starting from here, we can create some loops. So there's three main special callbacks that PICO-8 takes. There's the init function, which is called whenever your game starts. There's the draw function that is called every time it draws a frame, and then there's the update function that is called every frame, and it runs at a fixed 30 frames per second, right? So like if we have our little, we might create a little hero. There with my sprite guy ability. He's got orange pants. Missing the top of his head. Blue shoes. So we have our sprite. If we, on every draw frame, we can see that the sprite is this. We have our sprite sheet, right? And so this sprite is at position 001. So if we want to draw it onto the screen, we just call this spur function, which draws the first. We draw the first sprite, and we draw it at like 60/60 on screen. Then we run it. We draw the dude. He's there. So notably is like we forgot to clear the screen, right? And so since like this is running the actual game in the app, it does whatever we tell it to. So if we don't tell it to clear the screen every frame, it won't do that. So we have to clear the screen. So now we actually have that guy. So now we made a video game. That's a video game. And what we can do is we can save it. We call it a fitting name. And we can also create what is called a cartridge or a cart in like PICO-8 lingo. So like PICO-8 is this fantasy console, right? But it's software, it's imaginary. And so the cartridges, the carts themselves are also software, right? They're not these physical pieces of hardware. But if we save it to a .png file, then PICO-8 will automatically create this new cart. And what it's saying is that it needs this label, because that's the actual picture it's going to use for the cart. And it creates, so actually to make the label, we'll run it and we'll press F7. Right, so now we have the label image, and we can see that like in our actual files, oh my god, I can't read anything. Is this masterpiece? Higher?
Do you have the PNG or PNG?
The PNG.
You have 2 more down.
2 more down?
Very good.
Oh yeah, okay, cool. Thank you. And so this is like the actual PNG that we just created, right? We have to resave it to get the label loaded. So I'll write it. Right, so now this is like the cart that we made. It's an actual PNG file, like we can like open it in preview or whatever, and this is like what it actually looks like. The actual code and the data of the game is encoded in like the least significant bits of the PNG file, so it doesn't like change the image, but like it's all there, and PICO-8 knows how to read it, how to get it. The last thing we can do is upload it to PICO-8. I won't go through this whole thing. Maybe I will. We can create a post. And then upload a cartridge. And we can actually choose the cartridge file, which I can't even see it, so never mind. But we could upload it, and then we could like put it on the internet, and then anyone can grab it. And then you can use PICO-8. And then once it's uploaded, you can go to, within PICO-8, you go to Explore to explore the cartridges that you can find. And here are a bunch of different cards that you can just like download, right? So I could just download this or run it, and this is downloading from the internet and not running it. Yeah. So that's PICO-8. It's kind of weird. If you're thinking about using this to make actual like creative work, you might notice that it's a little bit, it has some like limitations to it, right? So notably, it's a 128 by 128 resolution. If you saw when we were editing the sprites, the sprite editor, there's only 16 possible colors you can use in the whole thing that you make, right? And they're all pre-selected. And there's a bunch of other constraints, right? Like the sprites have to be 8 by 8. There's only 64 sound effects. You can only use Lua, which is that programming language, in the code. And then there's other like sort of least visible constraints, right? So there's like 32 kilobytes of memory limit. There's a token limit, so there's like a limit on how much you can actually code with it. Yeah, so it's like sort of, it's annoying to use. And you might be wondering, especially if you're in this community, this processing community, like why would I want to use this? I can just fire up P5.js and I don't have any resolution restrictions. I can use whatever colors I want. I can like load images and do all this crazy stuff. Like this is a waste of time. But actually, you're kind of aggressive, and I would like you to calm down. But I actually really like this tool a lot. And I think it's because of the constraints. When I was, so story time, when I was a small boy, I would play a lot of video games. Play like Pokemon, Donkey Kong, a lot of like flash games on the computer. And I thought, wow, these things are really cool, I want to make one. Or actually I thought, these things are really cool, I'll never be able to make one because they're obviously made by like genius wizards that aren't real and that have like these like amazing abilities to like make video games. And then when I went to college, I studied computer engineering. I took a game design class actually, and I ended up making learned programming, and I ended up learning how to make games, and I made a game, or a couple of games with people for classes. The thing is, I never really made a game by myself, right? And so like all these games that I made for classes and stuff, they weren't like, you know, I didn't feel like I was expressing myself. I didn't feel like I was making a game that like I wanted to make. And so after I graduated college, I was like, I have time now, I'm going to make a video game. But the thing about making games is that it's sort of tricky. Like, you need all these different tools, right? So there's like this tool called Unity that is sort of like the standard for like making games. But then you also, on top of like programming in Unity, you need to like draw the assets and like draw the art yourself. And I don't know how to draw, and you have to like somehow like generate some music or some sounds. And so, you know, you use all these things. I have Adobe Illustrator up here as an example of a tool that you use. I never used it. I don't even know if it's a thing you make to illustrate things, but it has the word Illustrator in it, so I put it up here. But basically, there are all these like different like tools and things you have to learn, and the barrier to entry to making a game is like pretty high. And I spent 2.5 years working on this game, and it is a game made in Unity, and it's you know, it's not a game. Like it's not good. It's like I wish I could like animate it because you would get how bad it is once you saw like how you can actually try to play it. But it's not a game, right? Like there were some interesting things. Like there was like more than like 1,000 lines of code, and it was sort of this like beast of a thing, but it wasn't like a fun game to play. I watched this talk where someone was talking about rapid prototyping, and I was like, oh yeah, that's what I need to learn how to like make things fast because I'm spending 2.5 years on this thing that is not going anywhere. And they suggested using PICO-8 because PICO-8 sort of encourages rapid prototyping. And I was like, that's an interesting concept. And so I downloaded PICO-8, and then within 2 weeks, I did actually make like a full game. And it's like maybe, you know, a lot less like technologically impressive than all right, I was gonna demo it, but the technology guys don't want me to. So, but yeah, so it's this like little like sailing game. It's like a 2-player sailing game. You sail 2 boats around and you race, and like the boats bounce off each other. And yeah, again, it was like way less work, way less technologically impressive, but it was an actual like game that was fun. And the thing about it also was that like my experience using PICO-8 was like a lot more enjoyable than using Unity. Like Unity, I would like dread having to open up Visual Studio Code and like wrestle with like game objects and like linking things and like C#. And PICO-8, like every time I started it up and heard that like, I was like, ooh, we're gonna make some games. And so that was kind of like this weird revelation for me, or like a weird epiphany where I realized like maybe the way I think about tools and what makes a good tool is incomplete, or maybe there's something I don't understand. Because like on one hand you have Unity, right? You have like this thing that has been around for 15 years. It's the industry standard. It's made by a company of like hundreds of people. And on the other hand, it's like PICO-8, which is this like fun toy made by one guy. And one of them made me want to make video games way more, and made me actually like create a video game a lot better than the other one. And so I started thinking about like why that was, and I think a lot of it came down to this concept of like constraints and the creative process create creativity. And that's not like something mind blowing. I think if you create things and try to be creative, like you've probably heard this. I heard this a lot in like my writing classes, where it was like, if you have writer's block, then try to like give yourself some arbitrary constraint, and it'll kind of spur you to like make something. But the thing is that like, it's one thing to hear that truism or hear that piece of advice of constraints create creativity and try to take it to heart. It's another thing that the tool that you're actually using like forces you to pay attention to that, and like it forces these constraints on you. Right? So you don't have any choice. You can't be lazy and not give yourself constraints. Like you are constrained. Joseph White, or Zeph, the guy who made PICO-8, he has this thing in a talk where he said that tools crystallize process. And I think that that's really interesting in that if there are things that we have, as a society, as a human race, have discovered that like, oh, there are better and worse ways to have a creative process. Why don't we bake those ideas into the actual tools that we make? And so I started looking more into like different tools and trying to figure out like what makes a good tool. And I came across this dissertation by Kate Compton, who she just did this dissertation on this genre of tools called casual creators. And so casual creators are this type of creative tool that are they're made for creating things, but their emphasis isn't really on the output made by them. They're designed more for the pleasurable experience of creating, right? So if you think, and they're usually marketed to kids or to people that are creating casually, right? Not like professionals. So if you think of like, I use this example a lot, but like the character creators in like The Sims, right? So like when you're creating a character in The Sims, you're not like trying to create this like piece of amazing art to try to like revolutionize the world. You're just creating like, you're just having fun, expressing yourself, making this little like virtual person. There's a lot of examples of casual creators. There's like, this is like sort of like an older example of it's like Mattel's Knit Magic, where it was marketed to girls, and it was sort of to help them to knit different things. I'm going to keep using the example of the Sims character creator because that's what I'm familiar with. But yeah. So one of the interesting characterizations of casual creators is the trade-off between control versus power. So casual creators trade control for power. And they take away control from you, right? So like, if I am a professional virtuoso that's trying to create something, and I need a tool that gives me like the most control that I have so that I can like really express my vision through the tool that I'm using. But casual creators don't care about your vision or whatever, right? They just want you to have a good time using them. And so they realize that like, if they give you less control and they give you more power to just kind of like express yourself as fast as possible, people will have a more pleasurable experience, right? So like, for example, in the Sims character creator, there's a difference between using Blender, which is like a 3D modeling tool, to create your 3D model from scratch, and using this character creator, which in the end you'll have a 3D model created, but it gives you more power to create that 3D model, right? Because if I wouldn't be able to make a 3D model myself with Blender, but it also takes away that control of like, maybe you want to make a sim that is 20 feet tall. You can't do that in the character creator. You could do it in Blender, but you can't do it in the character creator. And so, thinking about control versus power, I think it's interesting that like a lot of professional tools. So if you think of like things like Unity or like maybe like a blank canvas or like Logic Pro, they sit on this end of the axis of having a lot of control, right? And on the other end of the axis of control versus power, you have these casual creators, which give you a lot of power but not much control. I think that PICO-8 sits somewhere in the middle. I think that it has a little bit of elements of both, right? There's this pattern that Kate Compton found in casual creators, which is this idea of no blank slate. So they found casual creator designers, people who were designing these tools, they found that when people used creative tools, they would often start using a tool, see like a blank canvas, and then freeze up and not know what to do and get anxiety. And I think if you try to create something, you know what this feels like, right? It's writer's block or creative block. It's sort of that anxiety of like, well, I don't know. I mean, like even if you have an idea, a lot of the times it's sort of hard to express it. And so what casual creators did is they realized like, okay, then we should just get rid of any sort of. We should never have a blank canvas. There should always be some default or something you start with. So in the Sims character creator, when you boot it up, you don't have like a blank void. You always have some person, a character there already, right? And sometimes even like in the later Sims, they randomize that character. And so you have something to go off of that you start with. PICO-8 sort of does this too, right? So the example that I showed you when I was making that when I was using PICO-8 and I showed you that like I took this game that I didn't make, but I started like remixing it and changing it. And that's what a lot of people in the PICO-8 community do. That's how they start. They don't really know how to code. They don't necessarily know how to know anything, but they just they get a game and they start playing it and they're like, oh, I like this. And then 2 buttons, they can see the source code and they can fiddle with one little character and change it and then start learning from there. I think it's sort of interesting when you compare PICO-8 to processing in Unity because PICO-8 itself is not open source, but all the work made with the tool has to be open source. And so what you get with that is you have, whenever you're playing a PICO-8 game, you're always just 2 buttons away from being able to see the source code and seeing the guts of it. When you're playing a game on the Nintendo Switch on the PlayStation, you can't just press 2 buttons and see the source code for it, right? That's not how it works. But then similarly, even though processing is open source, if you're experiencing something made with processing, so some sort of an app or something, the work made with processing isn't always open source. So you can't just always press a couple buttons to see the source. And you can't even sometimes see the source at all. But then the combination of PICO-8 not being open source, and the work with the tool is open source, I think that lets Zep, the creator of PICO-8, create this environment where anytime that you're playing anything, experiencing anything with PICO-8, you're always 2 buttons away from seeing the source. I think that's kind of interesting. Of course, with PICO-8, it's just somewhere in the middle, right? So it's not doesn't fully take away your control. It's not always completely blank slate. You can start with a blank slate if you want, like we did. Yeah. So let me skip it. Actually, no, it's almost gone. So another thing that they found is that you come to find that these casual creators have a restricted possibility space. So the idea is that like, in The Sims, like there's only so many combinations that you can make with Sims. Whereas if you're using Blender, like you can make whatever you want. You can model whatever you want. And the same thing happens in PICO-8. The PICO-8 has tried this happy medium where like if you're there's these restrictions that you have, right? Like there's 128 by 128 resolution. There's these colors. There's only certain colors you can have. But at the same time, you have a pretty good degree of freedom. And I think that that's interesting, right? Because like you don't feel sort of overwhelmed by like the agoraphobia of like having this like expansive things you can do, but at the same time you don't feel like cramped by it and like sort of restricted. You kind of have this, and the way that Zep or Joseph White, the creator of PICO-8, the way he talks about it, that's kind of this cozy room, right? Like you kind of like you feel like you can sort of feel the edges of what you can do, but you're not like too boxed in. And I think it's really nice. I think that like it's really nice that PICO-8 is designed with this idea of trying to make you feel good when you're using it, right? Like it strikes this happy medium between control and power, so that you can actually. So when you're making something, it's cozy, it's nice, it feels good, and I wish that more tools did this. I think it's like obviously it's great to be able to have full control and do try to get your vision great on a piece of paper or in software, but I also think that like not enough attention is paid towards how we feel when we create things. That's really important. We're not robots, right? So like how we feel and how we want to approach the work that we do has a lot of impact on what we actually make. So these are some tools that do that. That sort of I think strike this happy medium between trying to make you feel good and enable your creative work, but also giving you a lot of control. So to end it, like there's a couple thoughts. So Fernando Romalo, who made the Doodle Studio, he says like, a creative tool is an inviting piece of software centering on creativity out with a tangible artifact. So this idea that it's inviting in some way. And then Natalie Lawhead, who made Electric Zine Maker, says that I suppose at the end of the day, if it's something I would use, and that's the best I can shoot for. Everyone's tastes are different, right? So like, I used to think there was this idea of a perfect, tool, this like orb of energy that you hold in your hand, and that as you have some vision, it just automatically transfers that idea and manifests in material in the real world. But I think that doesn't make a lot of sense. I think that good tools actually maybe take a bold stance. Maybe they're very specific. Actually, maybe they have some ideology or some ideas or some aesthetics baked into them, and maybe they like a good piece of art. They are aware of their own limits and sort of lean into them. So yeah, that is it.
How would you compare PICO-8 to Scratch?
I realized I was doing this the entire time. How would I compare PICO-8 to Scratch? I think right. So Scratch. I'm not super familiar with Scratch, but Scratch doesn't have any actual you don't type code into it, right? They have
drag and drop.
Right, it's drag and drop.
But you drag and drop code.
Right. I think that they're. And then does it have any restrictions on sort of the colors that you can use, or the resolution or anything, or the visual thing? I think they're similar in that Scratch has this idea baked into it that it's hard to code, or it can be confusing to learn how to code, and so let's try to have these building blocks so that it's easier to sort of rock it and figure out what you're doing. So I think in a way it's similar in that sense, that it sort of recognizes that if we sort of take some control away from the user and give them this power of these blocks of powerful code, then maybe they'll be able to make more interesting things. I think that sort of a difference between PICO-8 and Scratch is that PICO-8 has this sort of this entire like aesthetic and style and like ideology into it, and it very much like leans into these ideas. Whereas I think Scratch is not as sort of like cohesive in sort of what it does. Like it's not a, there's not as much control in Scratch on like how you distribute things or how, there's not as much thought on like how it feels to program with it or to make things with it. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So I'm a researcher at the Game Innovation Lab at NYU, and this seems like a really fun tool to use for making strange things. Do you know if this is possible to kind of run headless without like having a person actually physically, like if I wanted to change the pixel colors on the sprites, for instance, is there a way to like write a script that could do that, or do I have to actually click on stuff?
Right. So there is an API, and there's just you can use all these stuff in the editor, but the idea is you can do everything in the editor, but when I make games, I don't use like the code editor because I think that font is illegible. So there's definitely a lot of hooks that you can do, and there's a lot of if you look into it, there's a lot of like tools that community has built around PICO-8 to make things easier. Yeah. So yeah, it is possible. Yeah. I also talked to maybe Bennett Foddy because he ran this class that was using PICO-8 to prototype games. It was pretty familiar. Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Okay.